Nick Enstice is a Senior Regional Policy and Programs Analyst for the Sierra Nevada Conservancy. His primary initiatives are the evaluation of ecosystem services, enhancement of water security across the Sierra Nevada, and communicating the benefits the Sierra Nevada region provides to the rest of the state. He has many years of experience in natural resource management and has collaborated with diverse stakeholder groups, including spending 3 years of service in the Peace Corps in Panama. He also learned, but has since forgotten, how to make hammocks there. He enjoys exploring the Sierra Nevada on foot and by car, and occasionally spends time under the surface of Sierra Nevada lakes. With that, Nick, I'll turn it over to you.
Great. Thank you very much for the opportunity to present this. And thank you for those viewers watching on YouTube. The presentation I am going to be covering, there's a link to the report that this presentation is based on in the chat window, and it will likely also be on the YouTube link as well. You can also find it on the bottom of each slide in this presentation. There's a link to the our home webpage, and you can find a link to the Mokelumne avoided cost analysis from there. The basis for the Mokelumne avoided cost analysis started with the events that occurred in Denver, Colorado in 1996, 2002, and thereafter. There were 2 large fires in the primary watershed that Denver gets its water from. About 1.4 million people rely on that watershed as a primary source of water. And these fires had devastating effects on their water supply and on their budgets. They cost over $145 million since that time. More than 1 million cubic yards of sediment fouled the reservoir, and they're still to this day struggling to dredge and remove that sediment to gain storage capacity back. In the wake of these events, there were some realizations by a large number of people, including the Denver public in general, that the water that they are using doesn't come from the streams. It has its origins in the forest. And since that time, Denver Water, the public utility agency in the area, and the Forest Service entered into an agreement whereby they would 50-50 fund not only restoration of the burn area, but also fuel treatments on the watershed that is their water source to prevent future fires from occurring. So this was the idea, the genesis of the idea. When we started to think about California and where California gets its water from, the map here on the left shows in blue where most of California gets its water from, and then how it is transferred down to Southern California as well as to the East Bay, etc. And the areas where the water comes from, what type of fire risk does it have? That was the next thing we looked at. And the map on the right is a screenshot from August 2013 of the fires that were burning in California at that time. And this includes the Rim Fire and the American Fire. And to our dismay, there's a great amount of overlap between the source of the water and where the fires are occurring. So the possibility was there that a situation similar to what occurred in Denver could occur in California. To further study this, we started an analysis that brought together a lot of organizations, and we decided to focus on an area where it was clear where the water was going to. In this case, it's the Mokelumne watershed, and the Mokelumne watershed is just south of Sacramento and Lake Tahoe, just north of Yosemite, and it provides more than 90% of the water that the East Bay of California uses. That would be predominantly Oakland and Berkeley. And it takes the water from Pardee Reservoir at the base of the Upper Mokelumne watershed and transports it approximately 90 miles via an aqueduct to the East Bay for the users to use. So there's a direct connection between the upper watershed and the users downstream. In making this team, we had 3 core agencies that were the planning team with Forest Service Region 5, the Nature Conservancy, and my agency, the Sierra Nevada Conservancy. We also had advisory and technical teams that were comprised of individuals from a large number of regional, local, federal agencies, and nonprofits. A variety of interests were represented at the table during this analysis to expand the notion of what we were going to look at in this process and to make sure we had the best available data and information on which to base this analysis. The primary goals of the project came to be to calculate the avoided costs of implementing fuel thinning treatments versus potential forest fires or wildfire under current conditions. We wanted to be able to identify where treatments and the types of treatments, where treatments could be located that would maximize the benefits to society, to identify if there's a way to, economically viable way to increase the pace and scale of forest treatments through new investment sources, and to use modeling to forecast future events. The process we originally started with began with a series of models that would be done in a sequential fashion, with the outputs of one model becoming the inputs of another. Our initial scope had it starting with modeling of bark beetles and bark beetle activity in the watershed, because bark beetles have a dramatic effect on localized fire behavior, as when bark beetles attack, they can attack in large numbers in specific areas and kill a large number of trees in a specific area. Those trees are then highly susceptible to wildfire and thus can change fire behavior. So taking model predictions for bark beetle activity and then putting them into the fire model would help provide a bit more, would hone the fire model a bit more. We would then run the fire model and take those outputs and put them into a sedimentation model. As it turns out, we used 3 different sediment models in this study. For the most of my presentation, I will only refer to one specific one, which is hill slope erosion, but we also looked at gully formation and gully movement. We had hoped to then take the sediment model outputs and then put them into a water quality model that had been developed for the watershed. Unfortunately, that didn't come to fruition. So the only sediment model or water quality information we had coming out of this was the sedimentation that would be expected to occur in the channels of the waterways. However, we were then able to ascertain which end users may be most affected by these outcomes, and therefore what economic impacts they may incur as a result of these events. And this was an iterative model. We would first start with current conditions and run it through the sequence, and then we would develop a treatment strategy, put the treatment into the models, rerun the models, and then we can compare and contrast. So the first thing we needed to do was to ascertain whether there are risks to this watershed with regards to bark beetles, fire, and sediment before we could devise a treatment strategy or see if one was necessary. Looking at the bark beetle forecast for the next 15 years, the black outline is the full Mokelumne watershed. The gray line bisecting going north to south on this image represents roughly 5,000 feet in elevation. So you can see that the expected bark beetle mortality above 5,000 feet in a lot of areas is they're expecting 25 to 100% of loss in basal area or 25 to 100% mortality of trees in those areas. Down below 5,000 feet, there really wasn't much impact. Unfortunately, because of the way the model outputs for the bark beetle forecast were, we weren't able to reliably use those as inputs to the fire model. So while we visually used this map to help guide our decisions, the outputs from this we were unable to put into the fire model directly. Running the fire model under current conditions, we were able to get a lot of parameters for fire behavior in the watershed. The purple outline indicates the upper watershed, with the blue area down in the bottom left corner as the reservoir where the water comes from that goes to the East Bay. And they ran the fire model much larger than the upper watershed itself because it allowed the fire modelers to ascertain where fires could start outside the watershed but move into it, an important consideration in this work. The fire models allowed us to look at not only flame length, which is shown in this, but also rate of spread, burn probability, and another of other parameters. In this presentation, I'm only going to be discussing flame length because that's what we used in subsequent models in this work. Here, the white areas represent areas where fire would not be expected to occur under normal conditions. The gray indicates a flame length of 0 to 4 feet, which for this project we deemed to be low fire intensity. The yellow was moderate fire intensity, which is a flame length of between 4 and 8 feet. And then high intensity or high severity was 8 and above feet in height. And there were some areas where the flame lengths were actually more than 100 feet in height. There's a gray area smack dab in the middle of the watershed just up beneath the two reservoirs. And that area is actually the site of a fire that occurred in 2004 called the Power Fire that burned 16,000 acres. So that area has unfortunately not regrown in the subsequent 9 years enough to, it's still very undergrown. There's just not the vegetation. So even if that area burned and burned completely, because the height of the vegetation is so low, it would not reach above 4 feet in flame length in that area. So we could see in the fire model that there were some areas that had very high risk of fire, high intensity fire. So we knew that there was a risk there from a fire standpoint. What about from a sediment standpoint? We ran the sediment, this is hill slope erosion, sheet and rill erosion of sediment granules of 2 millimeters in size and smaller. So this is very, very fine erosion, sediment about the size of sand or smaller eroding from the hill slopes. And looking at as the forest stands unburned or not using the fire model as an input as of yet, there is very little erosion to see in this. Most of it is green, which indicates less than 10 megagrams per hectare of erosion. A megagram is roughly 2,200 pounds, and a hectare equals about 2.5 acres in size. So under current conditions, there's very little erosion going on. Some going on in the upper elevations towards the right, which is the yellow because of the granitic area. But most of the watershed is very clear. When the fire model and the intensities that I showed a couple slides ago were put then into the sediment model, this was the result. And the 3,000 to 5,000 foot elevation, there's a town called West Point, just to the right of that or to the east of that. There are a couple of hot spots where it gets into the red, and So it's gone from less than 10 megagrams per hectare of erosion to exceeding 150 megagrams per hectare of sheet and rill, very small sediment erosion. So now, looking at the current conditions, looking at the fire threat and fire risk, and looking at the sediment that could potentially result from those burned areas, we could now see the potential was there for some pretty significant impacts. So this helped then guide us in, we knew where the hotspots were, and this could guide us then to determine where we would like to model treatments. So this is what we did. We determined which land types within the watershed would require a different type of treatment. And so the land types you see on the right-hand side, this would be wilderness and roadless areas, PACs, which are spotted owl protected activity centers, riparian areas. There's a large PG&E transmission line that goes through the watershed. Key roads, which were identified as important roads to either get fire equipment in to fight a fire or to evacuate people, were identified. Steeply sloped areas, which are areas with a slope greater than 40%. Parcels with structures. This was our the way that we approximated where the WUI, which is wildland-urban interface, where that is, where homes are that would need protecting. And then anything that didn't fit into those categories was categorized as general forest. So each of these land types had a differing treatment style or end result that was used in the modeling that varied based on which land type it was and the type of activity, from very little disturbance to a large change in canopy percentage, as well as a lot of biomass and fuels removed from the site, depending on what the land type was and what management opportunities there were in the area. The entire upper watershed is approximately 300,000 acres in size. The treatment strategy that we outlined here is a very coarse scale, 30,000-foot elevation, if you will, treatment strategy. It covers 100,000 acres in size, and in the areas that that treatments are proposed, it's 100% coverage. This is a scenario that is very unlikely to ever be implemented, and we certainly don't consider this as a plan. We wanted to better understand what the potential impacts of these treatments would be on fire behavior and therefore sedimentation. So we thought it better to do a large-scale look to see if it had an impact, and then if we determined that there was the potential for treatments to have a large impact, we could scale it back and begin to think about different restrictions to applying treatments and what a true treatment strategy may look like. And again, this treatment strategy was solely based off of the needs of this group and doesn't address a lot of needs that are present in the watershed and as a whole from other groups' perspectives. So taking this treatment strategy that's outlined here, we then applied that to the watershed to see how it would affect fire behavior and therefore how it would affect sediment. So as a reminder, this is what the flame lengths were out of the current conditions fire model. And again, along the North Fork of the Mokelumne, there's a large band of bright red, and on the South Fork there's a large patch of bright red as well. Once the fuel treatments were put into place, it changed to this. Now, because flame lengths would only affect the areas where treatments were put into place, there is no impact to flame length outside the treatment areas. The treatment would actually affect burn probability in adjacent lands, but that would not affect flame length. So flipping back and forth between the two, we can see that there's a very large difference between these flame lengths between current conditions and post-treatment. And in fact, all of the red that is in the post-treatment is roughly 10 or 12 feet and shorter in flame length, whereas, as I mentioned earlier, a number of the flame lengths in the pre-treatment current conditions scenario were greater than 100 feet in height. So the treatments had a large impact on the amount of flame length that is expected to come off this watershed. Now let's look at when we take the outputs from the post-treatment fire model and then put them into the sediment model. Let's see what happens with that. So as a refresher, this is only showing the treatment areas. So we can just focus in on those areas. Again, under current conditions and with no fire, there's very little sediment expected to come off of these lands. However, with fire put onto the landscape, you have that dramatic increase in the amount of sediment expected from sheet and rill erosion post-fire. When you do treatments and then have fire, this is what it looks like. So again, it's much more substantial than the no fire scenario. But comparing it to no treatments and fire, there's a lot less red here. So it has had an impact. It's not as good as no fire, but it is significantly better than not having treatments at all. And in the document, the full document, we outline the effect that treatments have on the landscape without fire, how much sediment is expected to come off the treatments just because the treatments were implemented. Because remember, we are manipulating canopy closure as well as doing things on the soil and perhaps removing biomass from the soil as well. So there is the potential for increased erosion to come off of those lands. And when we look at that number, so this is a general breakdown. The GeoF is the type of model that was used to model this sheet and rill erosion. The current conditions, on average across those treatment areas, is expected to be roughly 0.4 megagrams per hectare. Again, a megagram is roughly 2,200 pounds. When you put the treatments in, it increases by roughly 2 times to just under 2 times, roughly 0.7 megagrams per hectare. But contrast that with the amount of erosion coming off of a burned, untreated landscape, which is the fire following current condition. So it goes from a current condition of 0.4 to, with fire and current condition, 46 megagrams, and that's in the first year post-fire. The treatments and then fire is 26 megagrams, so it's pretty close to cutting the amount of sediment expected to come off of that landscape in half. It's still a considerable amount of sediment, but it's significantly less as well. So the treatments have an effect on flame length, and they also have an effect on the amount of sediment expected to come off of these landscapes. And it's important for me to point out that these models were run at relatively normal conditions. We didn't use extreme climate variables, extreme rain events, extreme fuel moisture levels to run these models, and I'll demonstrate that here in a moment. These are relatively, the GeoWet model for sedimentation is based off of average rainfall. So if you had fire in an average rain year, which unfortunately we haven't had for a little bit here in California, but if we did, then you would expect to get this. If you had a wetter year than average, then the rates would be expected to be higher than this. So we took this landscape-sized look at burn probabilities and flame lengths and sedimentation and tried to figure out the best way to develop an economic analysis out of that. And so based on fire history in the watershed and future forecasts, our specialists determined that it would be expected that over the next 30 years, 5 fires will impact the watershed. And so looking at the fire models that we ran, we teased out 5 fires based on average fire size and expected burn probabilities, things like that, to hone in on these 5 fires as potential fires that could occur in the watershed, to then look at how will those fires impact the watershed and the benefits that that watershed provides. Because we have a flame length for these fires as well as a fire boundary for them, we can spatially look at what resources are in those areas and are at risk to those fires and run economic calculations. So these are the 5 fires that we teased out. The red in this, the bright red in this map indicates the areas where flame lengths were higher than 8 feet in height, so high intensity fire. The darker red indicates the burn perimeter. The purple outline is the Mokelumne watershed, and the Party Reservoir is to the lower left in the slide. So this is without treatment. This is what the fires would look like without any treatment. When we put treatment on, which is indicated here in the light green, the flame length disappears, of high severity fire disappears almost completely. The fire in the upper right corner still has some high intensity fire within the treatment areas, but very little. And but most of the other 4 fires don't have any high intensity fire. As I flip back and forth between the slide, you can see the change in the fire perimeter. And in fact, the fires in the lower half of the watershed to the left of the screen diminish very greatly in size. A couple of important things to note in these slides is that the fires burn both inside and outside the treatment areas. It will be impossible for us to forecast where fires will occur in the future. So we will always be treating areas and having fires potentially burn inside and outside of them. So when we get into the economic values here in a moment, we are also including economic values in this treatment scenario of high intensity fire that occurs outside of the treatment area. Additionally, you'll see that there are large portions of treated areas that are not exposed to fire in this treatment scenario. And that's important because money was spent to put in those treatments, and they didn't have any economic value from the side of reducing fire intensity or fire size, and therefore reducing potentially suppression costs, for example. So we feel that this is a more realistic look at the economic values that fires in the watershed could pose, as well as the economic benefits that treatments may accrue. So this is a look at all these layers together. Again, so this allows you to really see the difference in fire perimeter pre-treatment and post-treatment, with pre-treatment being in the red and post-treatment being in the yellow. And the treatment area being in green. Another thing we were able to do, this is from our other sediment models that we ran, we were able to select a potential debris flow that would be expected in these fires as a result of the high intensity fire and the barren land landscape, and each of those are in purple. In the case of Fire C, at the middle of the screen, the debris flow only occurs in the pre-treatment scenario because it doesn't burn to that extent in the post-treatment scenario. And one thing I want to point out on this slide is the town of West Point, also in Fire C. You can see that Fire C impacts West Point in the pre-treatment scenario, whereas in the post-treatment scenario, it is untouched. And that has a pretty significant impact on the economic values I'm about to discuss. So in putting these pieces together, our pre-treatment conditions at the top of this, looking over the course of 30 years, the left-hand gray column stands for Tiger Creek Afterbay, which is a small afterbay that PG&E operates in the center of the watershed, and PR stands for Pardee Reservoir, which is where East Bay gets its water from. And you can see first year post-fire under pre-treatment conditions, Pardee Reservoir is expected to have 620,000 cubic meters of this type of sediment coming off of it. As opposed to in post-treatment, it would only be expected to have just under 300,000. So roughly cuts it in half the amount of sedimentation that comes down. The 30-year sediment generation for pre-treatment conditions for Pardee Reservoir is 941,000 cubic meters. And just to put that in perspective, that's about 750 acre feet in area. And according to Denver Water, an acre foot is enough for about 2.5 households a year. So again, 900,000 cubic meters is roughly 750 acre feet, and an acre foot is enough for 2.5 households a year. So not an insignificant amount of erosion. As it turns out, as it relates to Pardee Reservoir, because Pardee Reservoir is so large, this only represents a small percentage of capacity change for that reservoir. But it's important to point out that this is just a couple of sedimentation models. There are a number of other potential sediment sources related to fire that we did not look at in this, landslides being one of them. But these things that we're discussing here are what would be expected post-fire, but do not address chronic sources of sedimentation in the watershed. For example, the sedimentation that occurs annually from roads or bad culverts, etc. So anything that's forecasted here in our paper should be considered as additional or on top of what occurs annually from these other potential sediment sources. And this work really showed us how difficult it is to go from fire to a reservoir when it comes to sedimentation. There's so much in the way of variables that make it difficult to make a clear linkage between them and a strong linkage. But it also requires a number of different models to operate independently. The movement's so complex. So it really was an eye-opening experience to see how these different models can work together, but also the limitations inherent in doing that. This slide is similar to a slide a couple slides previous of the 5 fires that we forecasted the 30-year scenario for. And I really want to, this gets to the how conservative we were in running, or reasonable we were in running these models in our attempt. The 5 fires pre-treatment total approximately 50,000 acres in size. dark red line overlaid on top of the watershed is the boundary of the rim fire that occurred in 2013, which was 250,000 acres in size. So 200,000 acres larger in size. In running these fire models, we were really bound by what the fire history was in the watershed and in the Sierra Nevada and California in general, specifically the last 30 years of fire behavior. The last 10 years of fire behavior deviated pretty significantly from the previous 20 years. And unfortunately, the expectation is for that deviation to continue, if not get worse still in the future. And so the fires that were modeled here may not truly represent the fires that are expected in the future, may be too small and too not intense enough to really do credit what may be coming in the future. We just didn't have the correct knowledge to be able to estimate what those fires would look like, and we didn't want to put those variables and assumptions into an already inherently variable situation. So it's important to recognize that as we get into these economic valuations of these fires that is based off of historic fire patterns, not necessarily future fire patterns. And as we look at the outcomes of the rim fire, it's really clear that the treatments that had been done in the rim fire area really did have a massive impact on how that fire behaved. And if it hadn't been for those treatments, that there's clear indication that a number of communities could have been lost if they had not been there. So even under the more extreme circumstances of a rim fire, the treatments remained effective. So we feel that the benefits would just grow more dramatic if the fires become more extreme than were modeled in this circumstance. So we looked at a large number of economic valuations that we felt we could appropriately quantify in the watershed based on the data that we had available to us. At the top, we have the costs, and we have two different costs reflected here, and it's very important to specify that all of the benefits down below are based off of the fuel treatment cost of $68 million. The reason the $16 million is in there is because we talked to local land managers, and because the 100,000 acres is unrealistic in implementation, they felt that there was a potential strategy moving forward that a large number of the fire probability and fire severity numbers could be matched through a smaller scale treatment that still hit much of the same areas of the landscape, but just at a lower percentage of coverage. And that could be achieved at roughly $16 million. So that's more of a potential real-world implementation number. However, the model was not run at that implementation scale, and therefore the benefits cannot be discussed in terms of the $16 million treatment, only the $68 million in treatment. And that $68 million includes the initial treatment and then also maintenance of those treatments over the course of 30 years to maintain their effectiveness against the fire threat. And this assumes that starting year one, all treatments are complete. So as we go through the list of benefits, structure saved, avoided fire cleanup, merchantable timber, avoided suppression, etc., there's a large number of values there. And even under the low category, and the low to high, you'll need to look at the paper and a little more in depth to get the exact values that were different between low and high. In some cases, it was based on The low values were simply those that fell outside of the fire perimeter in post-treatment conditions, but were inside the fire perimeter in pre-treatment conditions. In some cases, the high values differed from the low because we included areas where within the fire perimeter, the intensity went from high intensity to low intensity. We felt that areas that were now low intensity would be more defendable, and therefore that structure or asset could be protected by the fire crews. At a minimum, these total benefits show a 2-to-1 benefit to cost ratio. Looking at other reports that have been done, especially coming out of the rim fire, the Earth Economics did a study coming out of the rim fire looking at a wide range of economic values that were affected by the rim fire. And they looked at a large suite of things that we did not look at in this report. So in general, they're additive. So we consider this the minimum. In this $126 million, we do not include costs associated with lost tourism, lost recreation, etc., which can certainly have a dramatic impact in the long term. So the costs and benefits really show that there is a great advantage over a 30-year period to performing the treatments, 2-to-1. Here it is in a chart to show the difference between them. It also indicates that there's no single category here that on its own is showing enough value to do the treatments entirely. It's really stringing together a number of different benefits to overcome the cost of the treatments. And it's a similar case with who the beneficiaries are. And here we have the federal government and the state of California being the primary beneficiaries. And I heard a quote the other day that I thought was pretty interesting. This really demonstrates that there's no silver bullet, but rather there's silver buckshot. So it's a large number of groups that benefit from these treatments. No single entity would get enough benefit based on our calculations to make the treatments worthwhile, but banded together, they all save well more than they would invest if they did it in a partnership. The cost that we didn't include, I got into this a little bit earlier, but air quality is a large factor. During the combined American and rim fires of 2013, hospital visits in the Reno area, for example, were increased greatly. Tourism in South Lake Tahoe suffered because of it, etc. Biological control, water quantity. We feel like water quantity and quality could be a large piece of this moving forward. Other talks in this series really get to the potential benefit that water quantity for California that could be accrued through fuel thinning treatments. I highly recommend you looking at some of those other presentations. Habitat and biodiversity, aesthetics, again, recreational values and cultural resources. None of these were accounted for in our study and would be considered additive to the values that I just showed. So we do find that fuel treatments can significantly reduce the size and intensity of wildfires. The economic benefits of fuel treatments can be 3 or more times the cost. There are many beneficiaries from these fuel treatments, especially from the perspective of taxpayers, both state and federal. And the estimated volume of sediment from post-fire is estimated to be large, but the avoided cost to downstream utilities were less than what we saw in the Denver water example. Part of that is likely due to the fact that Denver Water's primary reservoir, Strontia Springs, is really, really small compared to Pardee Reservoir. And so the 1 million cubic yards of sediment that they received as a result of those two fires was a significant proportion of their storage capacity, whereas in the case of the Pardee Reservoir, it would not be a large proportion. Thank you very much for your time, and I hope you enjoyed this presentation. Please take a look at the full document. It's available in individual chapters or as a full document on the website, www.sierranevada.ca.gov, as shown on the bottom right of your screen. And please let me know if you have any questions. Thank you.